February 2020, and welcome to episode 39 of Runchatlive. Wow, I have been stoked. So as soon as this guest actually said that he was going to come on the show, I've been thinking of very little else. I'm so excited to bring you shortly Alex Hutchinson. Just been chatting briefly before coming on air, and I just realized I've got so many questions to ask him based on, I'm going to have to stick to the book. I mean, I'd have an hour on just the previous books he's written and everything, but we're going to stick principally to the Endure. I say latest, it's been out for over a year now, a couple of years. So we're going to talk about that, and I can't wait for you to join me. Don't forget, if you are watching this live and you join us, then feel free to ask some questions. Alex is going to be coming to London, which is very exciting for Tom Goom's running conference. But we were just saying he hasn't been here for about 7 or 8 years. So, yeah, we're going to talk about that later on. Before I get too excited and bring Alex up, I must say thank you to our sponsors, the brightonbeardcompany.co.uk. They sponsor the show. And if you are, well, Valentine's Days, we haven't got time now. Maybe you have. If you're thinking of getting a late Valentine's present for your fella, then Brighton Beard Company are my number one source for beard balms and moustache balms and oils and brushes and bags. Fantastic produce, great sense, and great service as well. So do go to www.brightonbeardcompany.co.uk, and if you use the code RCL15, then you'll get yourself a nice 15% off. Can't recommend them enough. So, guest today, Alex Hutchinson. Again, I kind of presume that people know this guy, but I've done a little bit of research and asked people, especially runners. No, they don't know him. And it's incredible, because even if you think you don't know him, then you've probably read his work. If you've read Runner's World, if you've read Outside Magazine, the Globe and Mail, you've probably even heard people quoting his ideas. The book, Which Comes First, Cardio or Weights, that was back in 2011. And that was, or still is for me, just a Bible for busting some of the myths, which is what we love doing on Runchatlive, putting some evidence back into running performance and injury. So, and that was written back in 2011. So I've been following Alex for a long, long time now, and I'm absolutely pumped to be able to bring him to you here today. Today we are going to focus, though, on his book, Endure, Mind, Body, and the Curiously Elastic Limits of Human Performance, which quite rightfully so has been a New York Times bestseller. And it's particularly poignant because it covers the Breaking 2, which Alex was there watching that. And it's fascinating hearing how Alex's views and things changed during that time. And of course, now we've got the... we know that Kipchoge actually managed to do it. So there's a fantastic chance for us to look back now at that experience with what we know now with shoes and everything like that. So there we go. Very exciting hour it's going to be. Remember, if you are watching us live, then do feel free to say hi and join us. And if you're watching the recording, then you can still leave comments and leave questions, and we will get back to you. But without further ado, I shall now bring up to you Dr., which you have to give these words, Dr. Alex Hutchinson. Hello, man. There we go. Hey, how you doing, Alex? Thank you so much. I saw you laughing when I called you doctor. You're not used to that? Too formal?
Yeah. Well, I never want to pretend that I have a doctorate in any area that's at all relevant to anything I talk about now. So I tend to leave it aside.
But I heard it was a doctor in physiology, is it not?
No, it's a doctorate in physics. Yeah, I was clever in making one sound like the other, but yeah, no. On that 2011 book you mentioned, they put Dr. Alex Hutchinson on the cover. And at the time I was like, okay, I'll go with it, whatever helps. But now I'm a little more like, nah, let's not use the doctor when it's not called for.
I know. I mean, and you are continuing a fantastic line of guests who the main reason for me picking guests is modesty about everything. And I love to put people on the spot like that, because you are a fantastically modest fellow for everything you've achieved so far. And before we even get started, I just want to say thank you for everything you've done for the world of endurance sports. A fantastic journalist. The books, like I said, is a Bible. The Cardio, Which Comes First, is fantastic. So thank you.
I appreciate the very kind words. And I will say, if it gets me a better table in a restaurant, I will use doctor. But other than that, no, but seriously, thank you. I appreciate the kind words.
I'll just say quickly hello to Claire Minshall. and Toby Blandford. Claire is in the house as well, and you'll be seeing a bit of Claire, won't you?
Yeah, we'll be speaking together a couple days before the London Marathon in a star-studded lineup. So yeah, I'm excited about that.
We will talk about it a little bit later on. And hi, Toby Blandford as well, and hi, Osmond James. Obviously, if you've got any questions for Alex during, then thanks for joining us live, anybody, and fire away. I will get to them eventually. But first, he's mine, so leave him to me. Right, so where should we start? I've got so much. I was saying offline just now, my crib sheet is just, I don't think I've got any space left on my laptop. Let's start off with the whole Nike Breaking 2. I mean, that was fantastic for me because one of the articles which stuck in my mind back in 2014 when you were, I think it was Runner's World, where you were kind of given the task of collecting data and doing what you do, and predicting when the 2-hour marathon was going to get beaten. And you came up with what year? Remind me again.
2075. If you're insisting that I'm going to be truthful on what my prediction was, yeah, I predicted 2075.
2075. And I remember because I think that year I was talking to Jeff Gaudet and Runners Connect, and one of the questions he said at the end was going to be, "What do you think about the 2-hour marathon?" And I remember thinking, right, for that's going to be an Alex Hutchinson question. Let's do a search here for Sweat Science. What's Alex say about it? And I remember coming across that article, and I remember kind of spouting it out as if I made it up. But no, I did give you credit. But
to lead you astray.
How so when you got to Breaking 2, how soon after your prediction was that?
So yeah, I did this Runner's World article in 2014, and then it was late 2016 when Runner's World first heard from Nike saying, "Hey, we've got this project. It's been under wraps for a couple of years, but it's about to emerge from the ocean." So yeah, December 2016, 2 years later, and then another half year, another 6 months before the actual race took place.
Right.
So it wasn't like, humans had evolved in those 2 years.
Exactly. You couldn't claim that, the evolution card. So when you arrived there, I mean, this is a fascinating part of the book, because it's kind of, you mention it and then you leave that for a while and it comes back to some other characters and studies and research, and you come back to it. But that was a journey in itself, wasn't it? The time you were there, and your belief pattern kind of changed from the day you arrived to fantastic account of the last few minutes of the race. What did you actually think when you arrived? What was your thoughts?
So by that time, we had plenty of reason to believe that it wasn't quite so crazy. I still was betting against it. And I was still very surprised that Kipchoge came as close as he did. He ended up running 2 flat 20 and 25 seconds. But, again, like I was saying, it's not like humans evolved. The question was, what externalities had changed that make Nike or make me believe that it was possible. And so we knew some things were different. We knew they had some crazy shoes, although we didn't know as much about the shoes then as we do now. But we knew, at least I had been shown some data that I considered very reliable, that showing that these shoes were considerably faster than any shoe that had come before. We also knew they were going to do things, some pretty basic bread and butter things, like have a course that has no sharp turns and no hills, essentially, to speak of. And they're going to have perfect pacing. They weren't going to, in London every year, they assemble the greatest field, known to history. And then the field goes off and runs the first 5K in 14 minutes or something like that. And you think, well, they've just blown the race in the first 5K. So there was going to be none of that. The temperature was going to be perfect. They weren't even going to run the race if it was a couple of degrees too hot or too cold. And they were going to have pacemakers to draft. So you add all those things together, and it's like, okay, well, if that was the prediction that someone had asked me about in 2014, I might have made a different answer. I still would have thought it's a long shot. I think without the shoes, it wasn't going to happen for me. But yeah, so my changing belief was partially as a result of knowledge of changing circumstances.
I love your accounts, because it seemed to be a totally different. They were trying everything, weren't they, Nike? You described some of the things that didn't quite make it and stayed on the cutting room floor. Talking of shoes, for example, wasn't there talk of like a backless shoe or something, which they tried out?
The thinking in 2014 was that the fastest shoe is the least shoe possible. The only thing you want is what the runner absolutely needs. And they thought, well, most elite runners kind of land midfoot, forefoot. Why do we need a heel? Let's not waste any energy with a heel. And so in theory, that sounds fine. And maybe it's fine for 10 minutes, but towards the end of a marathon, all of a sudden, as you get tired and maybe your form is starting to fall apart. And so I remember actually the story on that is I wrote about those shoes, and I wrote what they told me, which was basically that they realized that all the runners hated it, and it was like no one would run in it. And we went through fact checking, and the Nike sources were pushing back, and they're like, well, they didn't hate it. They just, they didn't love it. And I'm like, yeah, whatever. The point is, no one wanted to run a marathon in that, and whether they hated it or just didn't appreciate it, they realized that was the wrong direction, and that's sort of what spurred them to say, well, maybe we should be pushing in the opposite direction. Maybe we need the heaviest shoe or the most cushioned shoe possible, if we can find a way of making it not heavy, not like running in boots.
Yeah. So, I mean, we laugh, but that is testimony to how Nike have now come up on top after many years of not being there, by going through these crazy ideas and stumbling upon what seems to be just a combination of different factors, which has given them kind of allowed them to hit gold for a sec. Wasn't there also something to do with arms, which maybe there's a lot of moments in your book where I just laughed out loud. And normally I'm listening to you on a podcast, either in bed, so I wake up my wife, or I'm on a train and there's a strange opposite me and I'm suddenly like coughing my tea in his face. But yeah, what was the arm thing?
Yeah, they basically tried running guys in a straitjacket. There's been a debate for decades now. It's like, are the arms useful in running? When you pump your arms, are you just trying to prevent yourself from falling over, or is it that you just don't know what else to do with your arms, or are you getting some propulsive benefit? And you can look at the literature over the years, and there's conflicting answers as to whether, if you just sort of let your arms swing loosely, is that just as good? And what they found is, let's not just let them swing, let's tie them up, let's get rid of them. And so they had them in, basically tied in a straitjacket, or with just a little bit of movement out to just enough to counterbalance the motion of the running. And they found massive improvements in running economy, like enough that it sort of makes me wonder, is anyone else gonna pursue that? But what they said again is, and they tested it with some elite runners. They had Matt Tegenkamp, who's a sub 13-minute 1500 meter runner, testing this out and showing improvements in running economy. But he was like, no way, I'm not running like this. Stop it. Get someone else.
See this.
My pride is too great for me to try this. They said he looked like a T-Rex or like one of the Three Stooges, doing a Ministry of Silly Walks kind of thing. So they were, and back to your point, credit to them. They were willing to try anything, to try crazy ideas, and to live with the fact that 99% of crazy ideas are crazy because they're crazy. But in order to come up with some ideas that nobody had really pursued, nobody was saying, what the next big thing is? Massive, huge, heavy, like platform shoes for marathon speed. Nobody was saying that. So it was super surprising and impressive that they were able to break out of the perceptions of what we thought was good.
Definitely. I just need, before we move on, I'm still thinking, were you privy to this? Were you watching elite athletes being forced to run down a track with their arms tied to their waist?
I didn't get the T-Rex demonstration. Oh, you
didn't get that demonstration.
Yeah, I would have been happy to try it out, but it is. So we got to go into the Nike Sports Research. There was myself and Ed Caesar, who was reporting for Wired at the time. And we got to go into the Nike Sports Research Lab, but it was as if they were allowing us into the heart of the Manhattan Project. We signed away our lives in triplicate. Wow. And you could see snipers at every corner, and if you were to look on the wrong desk, they would have just shot you down. So it was a tightly managed peek into their world. They were very cautious about what we saw and what we didn't.
And this, I mean, when I was kind of putting up some adverts for this, I was saying that your book is worth buying just for the insights into that experience of breaking two. There's so much more to it, but it's some fantastic stories.
We could spend a whole hour on the knobs and levers they were trying to turn, and look, let's acknowledge that it was a super controversial project, and there's a lot of people who perhaps rightly think, oh, that's not a direction the sport should go in. Leaving that debate aside, if you just accept that they were going to try and do everything to produce a fast marathon, they had a ton of fun and they tried a lot of interesting things, and it was a very interesting project to have a window on.
And as you point out in the book, and I've heard you saying, it was actually more of an achievement, wasn't it? The original breaking two, where you're taking off 2 minutes 25, was it? It's Kometo's record. even though they didn't break the 2-hour barrier, finding the way of taking that time off was far more impressive than taking off kind of 25 seconds, wasn't it?
To me, it was a massively bigger surprise to see Kipchoge run 2 flat 25 in Italy in 2017 than to see him run 1:59:40 in Vienna last fall.
Yeah,
that was still an impressive performance, but it was like at that point the genie was out of the bottle, and we knew that there was a lot of the stuff going on with the shoes, and we knew that it was never, no one was ever going to say, oh, 2 hours is impossible now that he's run 2 hours 25. At that point, it was more of a question, just like before any marathon, where you know what someone is capable of, or maybe even know what you yourself are capable of. Whether you're going to do it on that day is always a great open question. But it's not a question of whether it's theoretically possible. And so I think in Monza, that's what sort of shifted, for good, is that, okay, we know a human can move his or her legs that fast. The rest is, are they doing it in a fair way? And is it going to happen on the day? But it's no longer just humans can't go that fast.
I heard myself saying then that wasn't such a big deal, but obviously that sounded terrible. I was trying to say it because it was incredible. I mean, we take it for granted, don't we, that just because he's run that originally that he can do it again on the day. But obviously the concentration and the preparation and everything for Kipchoge to do that on the day was incredible. Let's take a little look, especially for people who haven't seen it before. People listening to the podcast, obviously you're just going to hear the commentary to the race now. That's why I kind of encourage people to pop over to YouTube if you are listening to it on the podcast, where you can see the video of it. But I'm just going to put up the last minute of the race, and then I want to mention a few things that we're going to see on there. So I'm going to play this now, okay?
Miles to school every day and back. He used to go to the nearest town on his bike to sell milk at the local market. And now, through hard work and discipline, he's pointing. Come on, he says. Eliud Kipchoge has the hand of history on his shoulder. He has less than 200 meters to go. Eliud Kipchoge, let's keep an eye on the clock, into the final 20 seconds. Eliud Kipchoge on his shoulder. 140, the unofficial time.
There's his wife.
Eliud Kipchoge storms into the history books in Vienna. 1:59:40, the unofficial time. The first man to run a marathon in under 2 hours. One final lung-busting stride for Kipchoge. One giant leap for human endeavor. And Kipchoge was right. No human is limited.
No human is limited. Fantastic. That was about 2 o'clock in the morning, wasn't it, for you?
Yeah. Yeah. That was, it was, I think it started at 2.
Yeah. So,
I'm still tired, actually.
It was amazing. And what a lot of people are talking about, and people have talked about since, is he made it look so easy at the end, didn't he? It was like he was going for a jog and smiling and waving to people. And that ties in really well to your book, because it gives you a chance to suggest what was going on there. What would you say? What would you say about his face? What were you feeling when you saw that happening?
I mean, I was amazed for sure. And seeing him accelerate in the last kilometer was pretty sort of impressive. It's not unprecedented. So you might say, well, that's crazy. No one does that when they're smashing a barrier. And if you actually look into it, what you find is everyone does that when they're setting a world record for the most part. It's an extremely common phenomenon. You'll also find that every 12-year-old who runs an 800-meter race will do that. You start out fast, you settle into a sustainable pace, and then you see the finish line. You're like, oh wait, I've got a little more energy. And this seems to be pretty hardwired into even the greatest of runners. So that to me doesn't necessarily tell me that he was just jogging the whole way or anything like that. It's a fairly human. It seems to be a hardwired facet of our behavior. And what was interesting to me actually was the opposite. In Monza, when he started to fall behind a little bit, I was still thinking to myself until the last K that he could speed up by 10 or 15 seconds in the last K, maybe get that time back. Maybe he's going to do it. And he didn't. And that's actually a more rare thing than what we saw there in Ineos with the finishing sprint. And that's one of the things that makes me think, man, in Monza, he really was stretched out to his limits. He had immortality sort of receding on the horizon, not that far away, and he couldn't chase it down. So I think he had got everything out of himself. Whereas it's pretty clear on this day that, if he'd been on pace for 2 flat 10, he would have found 10 seconds and been able to accelerate a little bit.
How much do you think, how far behind is someone else who could have done what he did? How much is down to just him as a person and all the factors that make him up?
It's a great question, because especially in the era of Vaporfly shoes and now Alphafly shoes, there's a lot of debate about, for a while, I think it was pretty much a consensus that Kipchoge is the greatest marathoner in history. You put together just not only his times, his Olympic gold medal, but his consistency. What is it, 11 or 12 marathons now, which is unprecedented. So he's got this amazing streak. But now, as it becomes more clear how good the shoes are, there's this question mark of, actually, is he just a 203 guy who's been lucky enough to get the earliest prototypes of the greatest shoes in history? And the counter argument to that, or at least the point of discussion, is, okay, but where's everybody else? He's not the only one getting these shoes. There were 3 runners at Monza. Who is close to him? And so there have been a few guys running 202, and maybe more to the point, a few guys that no one had ever heard of until they ran 202, running 202. So there's a sense that, and in those races, Kipchoge was, 30 seconds ahead or something like that. So he's in races where he's been pitted against the best runners in the world. He's more consistent than anyone has ever been, and he's ahead of them. It's not clear that he's 3 minutes ahead of them. He's 30 seconds or a minute or something like that. So, but it's hard to answer these questions, because on any given day he's running to win, right? So maybe in London he's actually 90 seconds better than those guys, but he's just keeping his powder dry until he knows he's ready to pull away. But I think it'll be interesting in the years to come to see whether Kipchoge was at the vanguard of an era where everyone's running 2:01, or whether as I like to believe, I'm a bit of a, I don't know, call it a romantic, I like to believe that he is head and shoulders above not just his own generation, but any generation that's come before. But it is hard to judge that these days, as the shoes keep changing almost more quickly than we can take stock of it.
Yeah, it was a total surprise, wasn't it? The whole things have changed so much now with the shoes and what we know about them, and then the rules kind of going backwards and forwards. And we could eat, like you say, I mean, if anyone is really interested in the shoes, I really, 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 really enjoyed your chat on Podchatlive with Craig Payne and Ian Griffiths. It's very worth, anyone who's interested in the shoes, because the stuff you come out with there and the debate with Ian and Craig was fantastic. So definitely go and check that out if you're interested in the shoes and the future. Alex has got some fantastic gems on that. So anyway, the book provides some great insight into that, but obviously it's not just that at all. It then paves the way for what actually causes people to stop, what causes fatigue, what causes pain. Do we stop because our body lets us down, or is it, as Noakes would say, like a central governor stopping us to protect us from doing injury and that sort of stuff? So before we do that, we never get too serious on this. I know the answer to this, and I took a bit of a gamble, but in the book, the wonderful thing about you, or one of the incredible things about you, is you test out a lot of this stuff on yourself. You're a fantastic runner, which a lot of people probably don't realize the extent of your running. Did you crack the 4-minute mile in the end? What are you now?
My 1500 meter best, apparently, according to the official IAAF tables, is equivalent to 4 flat 0.01 seconds.
There we go. Okay, so that's good enough for me. Exactly. So there you go. That gives you an idea of people who we're talking to. So that gives you the ability to actually put a lot of these tests and things to practice, which you have done, which you described during the book. But to give us an example of your dedication, tell me what was going on in this photo, or what rather had just happened in this photo.
I'm having a coughing fit just laughing. So for those who are not seeing the visuals, it's a picture of me in a homely looking electric brain stimulation bike tour through the Alps, where we were spending a week cycling great alpine passes, and every morning or evening we would get electric brain stimulation from a sports medicine team that works with one of the top UCI Grand Tour cycling teams. So to sort of experience, this is what they're doing with the pro riders. And in this particular case, we were riding up, I think it was Col du Galibier, and it was a absolutely brutal rainstorm at just above freezing, followed by snowstorm at higher altitudes. And I stubbornly insisted on getting to the top rather than hopping into the van like everybody else did. So they patiently waited while I sort of made it to the top with basically right on the border of hypothermia. I couldn't even operate my brakes anymore. And fortunately, just on the other side of the pass, there's a nice little pub. We went in there, and I walked in looking like something the cat had dragged in, and so the barmaid immediately, ran behind the counter and pulled out this bathrobe and put it over my shoulders. So the picture shows me comfortably ensconced in this bathrobe, sipping some hot chocolate after what was actually a pretty fun, fun in the sense of terrible ride up a Swiss Alp.
Just because you mentioned electric brain stimulation, like it was on Sunday I do a long run, on Monday I do electric brain stimulation. What was that all about?
Yeah, so it's a good example of the kind of thing that I find fascinating, but I'm very skeptical of. And the idea here is electric brain stimulation. It's a very low current that you run through your brain. You can do it's basically like a 9-volt battery and a couple of electrodes, and whatever region of the brain you affect, it changes the sort of baseline polarization of the neurons, so that they become a little more likely to fire to communicate with each other in response to whatever you're doing. And you can arrange it in such a way, at least according to some experiments, that you basically alter your perception of effort, that whatever you're doing starts to feel a little bit easier. And so as a result, you can keep going for a little bit longer. You can push yourself a little bit harder. There have been a couple dozen studies on this. Initially, they looked quite promising. As people have gotten more rigorous with the studies, the results have started to look a little less convincing. So I don't know whether it works, but it's definitely something out there. There's a company called Halo Neuroscience, basically selling brain stimulation headphones, and there's a bunch of teams, including Bahrain Merida, which was the team that I was visiting in Italy, using not the commercial devices, but their own sort of medical grade devices, which they go around and zap their cyclists with. So it's to me, if it works, what it tells, aside from the does it enhance your performance or not, but if it works even under controlled, only under controlled lab conditions, it's a nice sort of convenient illustration of this idea that what feel like physical limits are actually decided in your brain. If you can change your physical limits by changing how your neurons are talking to each other, then it's a reminder that when it feels like your legs can't take another step or maintain the pace, it's not necessarily that your legs are physically incapable of doing that. It's that your brain has decided it's in your best interests to slow down a bit or to stop or whatever the case may be. So that's why I find it so fascinating, but it is a bit crazy to be actually trying it, to be honest.
Yeah, but there's plenty of examples of you. We'll chat about some others as they come up. About you testing things out, and some of the things you put yourself through are quite incredible. And we'll mention them later on. But going back to what we're talking about, basically we're talking about what Tim Noakes, Professor Tim Noakes, is quite famous for with his central governor theory and his law of running book. That's something which kind of stimulated you back in. When was law of running? 80 something?
Well, yeah, he first wrote it in the mid 80s. I got my first copy. I think it was the 1990 or 91 edition in North America, and I read it cover to cover. I was in high school at the time, and it was the first book and really the definitive book of running that I had. That edition doesn't mention the central governor. He hadn't come up with the idea at that point.
Right.
So he sort of came up with it late 90s. He gave a speech in about 96, I think, at a conference that started to explore these ideas. So it's only the revised editions that have it. And for me, it wasn't until probably 2006 or so that when I was starting out as a science journalist, that I came across some of Noakes's papers that were questioning some really quote unquote obvious things. Like I think the first paper of his that I came across that really caught my attention again was, does dehydration impair endurance performance? And I was like, what kind of a stupid question is that? But then I read it and I was like, oh, the research is less clear than I thought. And so I read some more papers, came across this central governor idea, and that got me really interested. And I for the initial plan for what became Endure was basically the world according to Tim Noakes. And it evolved from there, but he really got me interested in this idea that maybe there's a little bit more than just my legs are full of lactic acid and therefore I have to slow down.
Yeah, definitely. So that's really interesting. I didn't realize that the central governor theory came kind of afterwards, that it was added on later on. Was was that a journey he was already kind of on, and he was it kind of mentioned, or kind of was he leading to that in the original copy, or?
I not that I have picked up, and I still have that 1990 copy on my shelf to my left. I think when I talked to him, I had a chance to sort of visit his lab. I think he was starting to explore these ideas as early as the 80s, starting to say that this picture we have where VO2 max is everything, and it doesn't make sense. And he was starting to publish some ideas in the 80s, questioning it, but he didn't formulate it as a theory or as a model per se until really the late 90s, or even early 2000s is when he really sort of got down to business with some of his collaborators and fleshed out what became this model.
Okay, great. Let's just say hi to a few people who've joined us, and it's reminded me of something. Actually, we're talking about Tim Noakes as if everybody knows and has read it and understands central governor theory, but we'll come back to that in a second. Just want to say hi to Tom. Tom Goom is listening on his drive home. Busy man, that Tom. Hi, Tom. How you doing? Nick Knight, podiatrist, is also listening. So, hey, Nick, thanks for joining us. Love the stuff you're putting out lately with Run3D. Katie Napton is here. Hi, Katie. Lydia Campbell, who's just a fantastic person, another local to Brighton like myself. She's in the house. And James Morgan is here. These names probably mean very little to you. Although you do spend quite a lot of time on social media these days. I didn't realize how much time you actually are on social media.
More than I wish I did, but somehow it's fun. And so
these are all people who I feel like James Morgan, for example, I feel like I have met, but I haven't. I've just seen pictures of him with his kind of wolves and stuff, but he's watching whilst eating cheese. And Matt Hart as well. I love my job. Well, it's not a job. I love this, seeing people. So thanks for joining us. So some of you I know, particularly runners as opposed to therapists, are not that aware of what central governor theory proposed and also why it caused so many feathers to be ruffled. So could you just kind of break down in a nutshell what the central governor theory proposes and maybe give some examples which lead to that being a more likely hypothesis than the traditional?
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess that basically what the central governor theory or model would say is that you can't push yourself to your true physical limits, that we have a protective mechanism, and the details or the ideas of how or why that works have evolved or changed over the years. But initially it was sort of the idea that, if you push too hard, you won't be able to get enough oxygen to your heart or to your brain, and you'll have a heart attack and die. I think these days people would be more likely to say it's more of an evolutionary thing where we've learned to conserve energy, don't waste energy, and we've maybe it's the hunters who would chase the antelope across the savannah until they sort of keeled over, didn't make it back to the campfire and pass on their genes, and so we have this sort of behavioral, this thing called fatigue, which becomes quite extreme at the closer we get, sort of like an object, as it gets closer to the speed of sound, it gets heavier and heavier and harder to accelerate. As we get closer to our limits, we find it harder and harder to keep going. And so, I mean, and there's various ways you can sort of illustrate what this feels like. One of these things, as we were talking about earlier, is the fact that even when people run world records, it's like they're running as hard as they can, then they see the finish line and they speed up, almost as if they sort of on some level realize, the danger is past. We're not going to keel over and die. We're going to be able to stop in a sec, so we can unlock some of this energy we've been saving. And so as the debate has moved on in the last decade, say, there's a lot of debate about, is this some sort of unconscious, involuntary protective mechanism? Or is this just called pacing? This is just a function of, like, we're rational, intelligent people. And so we don't, if it's a marathon and you're more than 8 years old, you don't just take off at a sprint. And so, and it's possible to pace perfectly, so you often have some energy left over. Or is it as some sort of rival theories that have, I think, grown out of the central governor model would argue, is it more it's sort of a conscious thing that we just have a perception of effort, that we're always balancing how hard does this feel and how hard am I willing to push? And at a certain point, you get to a point where it's not about your legs have reached some critical state. It's too hard. You have to put in too much effort, and so you decide to stop, as opposed to the initial central governor, which was you don't even know it's happening. You're just being kind of slowed down. So anyway, this is a sort of a long rambling answer, but there's a lot of nuances to it. But the fundamental thing that I think has stayed pretty constant in the theory and other theories is you don't reach your physical limits because there's some physiological variable that has hit 100%. The variable that has hit 100% is how hard it feels. It's a perceptual measure in your head. Yeah.
I think most runners can relate to that, where you think you can't go any further and you see the finish line and then suddenly you're sprinting for that kind of money shot when you cross the line. And I think it's very useful, and definitely I've used it for helping educate people with regards to modern concepts in pain. The idea that pain is the output, and just because something is hurting isn't a measure of damage. So it's kind of ties in very nicely with that, which is what made it so exciting for me.
Interesting. Yeah.
There's definitely parallels with it. And also there's the danger of people suddenly thinking, oh, pain's all in my head, and you can separate the brain from the body and it becomes this kind of like dichotomy that doesn't really exist. So there's the same pitfalls, but I think for a lot of therapists and runners, it's good to go through the theory and take home what the message is that, yeah, our body is strong and robust. And one of these signs is it actually defends us. It's got this alarm system, which is fantastic, and it won't let us kill ourselves. It's got limits, which is healthy, and it helps people get better. I think if they are injured, they realize the pain is actually the defense and not the defect sort of thing.
Yeah, that's and I mean, I think it's also important to sort of avoid, to make the point that it's important not to flip to the opposite extreme and then conclude that everything's in my head, like you were saying, both in an injury perspective and in a performance perspective. That you can't just decide that you want to get an hour faster for the marathon, and it doesn't matter how tough you are. We're working within a physical constraint, but just understanding that there's a more dynamic back and forth between body and mind than we may have assumed. I think it can be helpful to see the times when you're maybe limiting yourself prematurely, but it doesn't give you superpowers necessarily.
No, not superpowers. But then when the accumulative effect of it, like I remember one year in Brighton Marathon where I am, it was a really hot year. I can't remember, it was a few years ago. I wasn't running because I'd had kids and little toddlers. There was no way I was going to be able to train and sleep enough. So I took to actually filming a bit of it, and I took some footage just to make a point over. I got some lovely classic footage of people who were over pronating, and yet they were set to do a 3:20 marathon. It was like shock horror. Surely they should stop and buy some stability shoes, sort of thing. It was cynical me lying on his belly filming marathon runners, and also heel strikes as well. I was kind of doing my own version of Pete Larson's kind of Manchester Marathon, showing that, and I felt very important. It was great. But one of the things I did notice, because I was trying to track some runners, because it was such a hot year, and after seeing people later in clinic, some people really did badly. They had to stop. The effect on them was just they weren't continue. Yet other people actually got their PBs, and they actually did better than any other year, even on a year where it was less hot. And I was kind of thinking this around in my mind, and eventually I came up with this theory that if you see kind of marathon roadkill, so people lying down with St. John's ambulance pumping them and stuff, and people have just stopped, depending on your personality, you could interpret that in two ways. You could either look at them and think, oh my God, they're really suffering. I'm the same. I'm immortal, and I'm going to suffer as well, which could have a disastrous effect on you, and you still feel the fatigue. Or you could think, wow, look at them. They're really weak. I'm not like that. I'm superhuman. And I think that's what happened to some people, because I asked people on the couch, I said, when you saw the people in trouble, did you feel like, oh, look at them, I feel really bad now, I'm going to stop as well? Or did you think, wow, they're really weak, I'm superhuman? And there was kind of like a correlation with that. People who did really well actually got enthused by seeing the devastation, and it made them feel, it empowered them, whereas other people took it the other way. So I thought that was quite a nice example of how important the actual perception is of what you see visually. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, and I think heat's a great example of one of those things where it's definitely not all in your head. Heat has effect. You're not going to set a world record in hot conditions, but there's also plenty of evidence that your perception of heat, that we slow down before we actually get hot, to put it another way. I mean, this is actually one of the sort of early lines of research in Noakes' lab. It's like you send someone out for a 10K on a warm day. They don't just run at their usual pace until they reach some sort of critical heat. Their muscles start to boil and they slow down. They slow down right from the start. Even if you don't tell them how hot it is, because they're already sort of perceiving, I'm going to be in trouble at some point. And so they're making some estimates, and those estimates may be fundamentally conservative. I mean, it depends on the person. So they may be keeping themselves safe by holding themselves back more than they need to. And so then when you take it a step further and say, okay, well, let's do these sorts of experiments, but let's mess around with the thermometers so that it reads hotter than it really is, or it reads cooler than it really is. You discover that the reading on the thermometer, their knowledge of the temperature actually has as much of an effect, or a large effect, as large an effect as the actual heat. So both are real, but one is under your control. You can't control the temperature, but you can control whether you're being excessively cautious. But what defines excessively cautious is, of course, a tough question. And so sometimes it is better to be a little extra cautious and make it to the finish line. And we saw that at the World Championships last year in Doha, where the most successful marathoners were those who basically just set out at a jog and were able to keep sort of moving through the field. It's a great example of you can't pick one or the other. You need to understand both.
Yeah, there's some incredible examples. I mean, the story of what we regard as heat stroke, and also the idea of dehydration and how what we imagine the traditional concepts. One of the things which struck me and made me think, oh yeah, light bulb moments, was where, like a lot of people in theory suffering from heat stroke, it always seems to get you when you cross that line. It's very rare that people collapse halfway through a race, and it kind of that. And you brought that out. Okay, so obviously maybe I can't remember who it was. Who was it? Your thought? Was it someone else who thought, well, it's something to do with stopping? And that led to some studies, didn't it? Or
that's actually Noakes, Tim Noakes.
Was it Noakes? Right.
He's had a big influence in challenging conventional wisdom in a lot of different areas. But it's and the link between dehydration and heat is definitely not as clear as it seems. And if you're going to get heat stroke, you're probably more likely to get it on a hot day in a 10K than you are in a marathon, because it has to do with heat production. And in a 10K, you can go faster. You can basically turn your engine up hotter. Whereas in a marathon, it's hard. You have to sustain a lower intensity because you're out there for longer. So you actually are a little bit less likely to run into heat stroke. And a lot of things that we call heat stroke may well have nothing to do with heat stroke. It's just that you cross the line, you stop running, your blood pressure drops because you're no longer pumping blood. You're no longer using your legs as sort of calf muscle pumps to pump blood, and so blood pools in your legs, and you collapse. And you're hot because you just ran a marathon in hot conditions. But the only reason you collapsed was because you had a drop in blood pressure.
Yeah, that's fascinating. There's some great. I think Alberto Salazar was an example of that, wasn't there? Was it the Duel in the Sun or something? Or
well, he has had a couple where he was sort of, had read his last rites because he collapsed.
Yeah,
and people always attribute that to dehydration, but it may well just be he's not well equipped to handle hot conditions. He's bad in the heat, and he was a super tough racer. He was able to push himself, and heat seems to be one place where the quote unquote central governor isn't perfect. It can be it's very hard to, if I get up right now and just run down the street and say I'm going to run myself unconscious, I won't be able to. I'll get tired before I can run myself unconscious. In heat, it's still very hard to do that, but people seem to be a little bit more likely to be able to do that in hot conditions.
As you're talking, I'm thinking there's so much in your book where there's comedy in the book with some of the examples, and then there's also some your book got very macabre and gruesome when you were talking about how testament to how some people survived dehydration and how long they managed to survive without. Are you thinking of the particular example that I'm thinking of? Or
yeah, those guys in the desert for I can't remember how long it was. Kept alive by the hope of knifing the guy he thought had betrayed him for the location of the hidden gold mine. And it just the description of his gums peeled back and all the cuts on his legs, which are just dry because he had no more fluid. But yeah, so it's one of those things where it's like you can't look at the Guinness Book of World Records to see how long you can last without liquid, because those people die. But occasionally you get these anecdotal reports of perhaps you don't really know the accuracy of the report, but you can. It sounds like there's some pretty gruesome stories.
Some of them. And then there was the I can't remember how many days it was. It might have been 18 days in the basement. The policeman chucked him down there, and he survived.
Yeah, some small town in Austria or something, and they put him in the basement of the chateau and then totally forgot about him. And apparently, so and again, nobody really knows. This guy he's totally traumatized. He doesn't really talk. He doesn't give press interviews or anything. But the theory was it was such a dank and unpleasant basement. There was condensation on the walls. So he was able to maybe lick some condensation from the walls of his basement cell that allowed him to take, I think it was 17 or 18 days with no food and no water, which was in the Guinness Book of World Records for a long time. I think in modern editions, I think they've stripped out some of these records because they don't want people going for them.
Yeah, that makes sense, especially in this day and age. Let's go to, there's also some fantastic studies on the subject of dehydration, for example. You bring up some amazing studies which were done basically to show that, one that comes to my mind was differentiating between the actual swallowing mechanism, telling your body that you're actually going to have water, but then not having the water, and showing that performance was still actually there. Tell us about a few of those studies. I think it was with cyclists mainly, was it? And
yeah, and some of them are just basically looking at thirst mechanisms, not even with exercise, but sticking nasogastric tubes basically down into your stomach. And so you can disambiguate it. You can have someone swallow water and simultaneously you can suck the same amount of water out of their stomach. So you get the pleasant feeling of water going down your throat. Or you can do the opposite. You don't let them drink anything, but you just infuse water into someone's stomach directly. And so they're as hydrated as they would be if they've drank, but they didn't activate the sensors in their throat that tell them that, oh, there's cool, refreshing water going down my throat. And there's other studies where they just infuse water or saline directly into the bloodstream. Again, and they do it blinded. So you're cycling, and there's a guy behind a curtain who's got a needle into your arm or whatever, and you don't know whether you're being given fluid or not. And whenever you do studies like this, what you discover is that the effects of hydration, of actual hydration in your body, are way less significant than what you find if you have a study where you're drinking, because otherwise you're drinking or you're not drinking. And if you're not drinking, you're like, this sucks, man. Why am I in the group that has to sit on this exercise bike for 3 hours? You haven't let me drink anything for 5 hours before the study, and now I'm doing this 3 hours in this hot room. People are pissed off and their performance suffers, and they're like, and then you say, see, dehydration is brutal, man. Even a little bit of you're screwed. You can't do it. And it's like, well, actually, if you rehydrate them with the IV, they're fine. Or if you let them, drink a little bit of water to wet their whistle. It's not that dehydration doesn't do anything. Again, just like heat, dehydration has effects, but some of those effects are mediated by our expectations and by we have sensors in our throat, in our mouth, the feeling of cool water going down your throat. It's like, everything's going to be fine. I'm hydrated again. And that's why, in the hydration literature, there's arguments about, well, what does it mean to drink to thirst, or just to drink till you're not thirsty anymore, till you're full? There's a lot of nuances, because you can feel pretty good just by taking a few swigs of cold water.
Yeah. And it's still by no means resolved, is it? There's still very much two camps.
Definitely not. Yeah. There's maybe 20 camps, but yeah, two main ones. And, yeah, it's like so many things in science, it's pretty polarized. And so there aren't a lot of, I don't want to say this in a way that sounds like people are rigging the results, because they're not, but it's like the way you design studies influences the answers you get. And it's so that everyone's sort of quite good at getting the results that they expect, just on a subconscious level. And so, I think, and the unfortunate, like the hard message to give that I would think that I believe is that the answer is somewhere in the middle. That people have switched from you have to drink as much as you can all the time, or at least as much as you can tolerate, to just drink when you're thirsty, you'll be fine. And I think from a health perspective, if you're going out for a run, a Sunday long run, just drink when you're thirsty, you'll be fine. But if you're trying to maximize your performance in a marathon, it gets more complicated. First of all, because along with drinking, you're trying to take in fuel, to carbohydrate or whatever the case may be. So it's not just about hydration. But I even aside from that point, I think there's more to it than just drinking according to thirst at that level, if you want to really optimize your performance. So I find that people tend to be in either one camp or the other. It's either you have to have the full science dehydration plan, or you're just like, dude, it's going to be fine. I'll find some water on the side of the road and I don't need to worry about anything. And it's like, I'm in the middle on that, to be honest.
Yeah, I think it's kind of when you I'm going to get later on to what some of the reactions to your book have been, but I think it's all about weighting it, isn't it? Some people put too much emphasis thinking if I drink continuously during my race, I'm going to have the energy to get to the end and everything's going to be fine. And when people realize that the water is probably not making as much difference as they think compared to other factors in their control, maybe even just how you feel. I mean, there was a lovely example of where you tried to put everything you'd learned, or a lot of the factors together for you. Was it your first marathon?
It was my
you
first
used
marathon,
some of Markora's kind of, and it was great because you were swishing water and you had people strategically placed to hold up signs and things. And what else? And you did the
brain training.
Yeah, tell us a bit about the brain training, because that was
the worst moment of my life. Yeah,
there we go. Tell us about the worst moment of your life. Let's bring it all up again.
So the idea here was going back to the idea that your perception of effort that matters, is that there's now, over the last 10 years, one of the most sort of interesting trends in sports science has been the recognition that mental fatigue impairs physical performance. That if you spend a lot of time thinking, if you're doing your calculus homework or whatever, and then you go out and try and run a race, your ability to sort of hold your finger as close to the flame as possible and push yourself it may be compromised. And so the question is, how do you deal with that? And look, the honest the takeaway answer that I hope that people should remember is, well, you become aware of mental fatigue and you make sure you're well rested mentally as well as physically. If you you taper before a marathon, you should also not do your taxes the day before a marathon. Give yourself a break, chill out, make sure you're mentally fresh. But another approach is to say, well, maybe I can make my brain resistant to mental fatigue. And, if I want to build my physical endurance, I go out and do physically tiring things and my body adapts. So if I do mentally fatiguing things, I should be able to train my brain to resist mental fatigue. And one of the ways they induce mental fatigue is you sit at a computer and you do these kind of computer games that are fairly simple. Shapes and letters flashing on the screen, you respond to them as quickly as possible. You do that for 90 minutes and you're ready to shoot yourself. And but it induces mental fatigue. So I tried for 12 weeks. I tried doing that. I built up to, I can't remember if I got up to 80 or 90 minutes as my longest session. I was doing it about 5 times a week. And look, the plain truth is I have no idea whether it made any difference to my marathon performance. It was my first marathon. I can't judge whether it helped, but I do know that I'd have to improve by an hour to make it worth sitting through those brain training sessions, especially, you've got a job and a family and you're trying to train for a marathon, which takes time already. And then you're like, oh, by the way, honey, I can't help with dinner tonight because I also need to go spend an hour in front of the computer clicking buttons in response to a square versus a circle. It doesn't fly very well.
Yeah, you paint a fantastic picture in the book of you after 5 minutes just flaking out. And then, I think we should mention Professor Samuel Markora here, because that was all he does a lot of work on that, doesn't he? Let's bring him up here. His name seems to come up in your book nearly as much as Noakes. So tell us a bit about this guy. And
yeah, absolutely. So Markora is Samuel Markora. He's an Italian researcher. He's been at the University of Kent for a long time, although he's recently, I think he's in the process of moving to an appointment in Italy. Maybe University of Bologna, I think, but I could be wrong, so don't quote me on that. He's done a lot of really interesting work that I think the way I would characterize it, and he would strenuously disagree, but I would characterize it as taking the ideas that Noakes sort of planted and then starting to test them and put them on a more falsifiable basis, so that he, we can say, okay, what would it mean if it were true that our physical limits are dictated by perception of effort? How can we manipulate perception of effort? How can we change it and see if our physical limits are dictated by the legs or the muscles? So he's done a lot of very elegant experiments, and he would say his work has nothing to do with Tim Noakes's, that it's a separate category, and that's an argument that I don't want to. I'm not the judge of whose work is influenced by whom, but to me, he's kind of the person who's most effectively taken up the baton that Noakes planted in the late 90s and taken it to the next level of trying to have a coherent theory that makes predictions that we can test about what the best ways are of enhancing performance, including things like trying to build resistance to mental fatigue.
Yeah. And the books, I mean, one of the things which I see, most of the people you kind of fall in with are kind of a little bit masochistic in themselves. All your favorite researchers seems to be people who are willing to put themselves through hell as well to prove their point. And Markov is no exception, isn't he? Because he did his, what was it, 13,000-mile motorcycle ride, Beijing, London to Beijing, wasn't it? Which was just a crazy trip. And you describe it in great detail, wonderful detail in the books. One of many incredible people.
And testing himself every morning and every evening for reaction time, and he was giving himself a sequence of pills where he didn't know whether or not he was getting caffeine that day to see whether it would enhance his ability to not crash. He did in fact crash and broke his, can't remember what he broke, his
you mentioned
arm or something, his ribs,
ankle, and shattered rib.
Yeah. So I was sort of jealous of the trip. It sounded awesome, but then as I heard more about it from him, I'm like, yeah, I'm not sure I want to be riding across the Tibetan plateau in soft sand on a motorcycle with a broken ankle. That sounds like it's actually quite challenging.
And it was him with a team, was it? Or was it by himself? I can't remember. There was a few of them.
Yeah, it was a group. There was a travel group, so he had people with him, but that only goes so far.
Yeah, it's quite incredible. And I think I mentioned before off air, I asked whether, because some of the descriptions of the people doing research on themselves in particular is almost, it's an ethical question of should we kind of encourage these people to do it? Because if you're going to test the limits of human endurance, you're going to take yourself to some pretty nasty places. You sitting in front of a computer, hitting a button when it was a dot or a square, we can live with. When it comes to people actually taking themselves very close to some, well, let's bring up, for example, I think because we're running out of time, I just want to give a mention in particular to this guy here. Who is probably the first story in your book showing an example of the limits of endurance.
Henry Worsley.
Henry Worsley, which was an attempted crossing, wasn't it? Solo crossing of the Antarctic, and a tragic death as well. It's a real sad story, but it's important because it sets the scene for the question, which I think prompted Noakes and yourself, is why do more endurance athletes not die? What is
exactly? It's the opposite question of what you'd think. It's that people are extremely motivated. It's not especially like, and one of Noakes's examples on a similar vein is he shows a picture of the finish of just after the finish of the 1996 Olympic marathon, where I think the winning margin was 3 seconds, and the first and second place finisher jogging around the track waving their flags a few seconds or after the finish, and it's like, this guy just lost the Olympic marathon by 3 seconds, and he's jogging now. And it's not that he wasn't trying hard. He was trying as hard as a human can try. If people could run themselves to death, they would, but they can't. It's very, very hard to sort of, in the absence of, I'm not talking about slave galleys and things like that, but in a sort of purely voluntary way, it's very hard to run yourself to death. And Henry Worsley it's arguable whether he's an example of this, but he did this extremely, extremely arduous thing where unlike, say, Ernest Shackleton, Worsley didn't have to decide, okay, things are getting rough, I better turn back because I need to make it all the way back home. He knew he could call on his satellite phone for extraction. So he was able to kind of keep pushing right to the point where he thought, I literally cannot go on. And so he did that. And then by the time he called, he realized sort of 71 days or something into his trip that he couldn't keep going. He called and, he was picked up, 6 hours later or something like that. But he died in the hospital in Chile shortly after from massive organ failure. He probably, the theory now is they think he had an ulcer which burst, which gave him a bacterial infection and stuff. So it wasn't a simple case of him just sort of going until his legs fell off, but it was a case of someone who was so exceptionally motivated that despite what must have been just crippling fatigue, he kept going to the point where it was impossible to save him. So, it's a tremendously sad, but fortunately also tremendously rare, because he didn't starve to death. He didn't get eaten by a shark or anything. There wasn't something specific that killed him. It was this sort of pushing and pushing.
Yeah, it's it's amazing opening to the book, almost opening to the book, and there's plenty of other characters in there as well that you talk about who fortunately didn't die, but it's the book has got so much in it, and unfortunately we haven't got time to mention them all. But that's probably a good thing, because otherwise people aren't going to bother watching reading
that's right.
book.
Yeah, that's right.
Listen to this.
Pick up the book and you'll see all those other characters.
But I think it's worth having a preemptive. We mentioned it off air. I've seen some criticism. Well, one person on Amazon, I think, kind of said, "Oh, this book bloody doesn't give you any answers. What's the point of that?" And I kind of read it and thought, you so haven't got the point of this, have you, mate? It's like, but then I thought, because your book, Which Comes First, Cardio or Weights, was kind of a top 50 kind of myths, and here's what you can do instead. But this book never set out to do that, did it?
Yeah, it was a deliberate choice, and let me say first that I absolutely understand that criticism, and I've had that comment from other people at talks and stuff, that saying, I got to the end and I wasn't sure what the answer was, so what are we supposed to do? And it's like, yeah, you and me both. I don't know what the answer is either. I enjoyed sort of exploring the dark byways of what endurance really means, but I don't have a sort of 5 easy steps to smash your PBs. And the reason, put it this way, I've been in magazine journalism long enough that I know how to write 5 ways to do X or 5 ways to do Y. I mean, that's the sort of general formula for magazine pieces. So I know how to do that, but I didn't want to do that here, because once you decide that these are the 5 pieces of practical advice I'm gonna give, it immediately makes you start seeing all the research through the lens of those pieces of advice. So this is just a human way. If I had done that, I would have started to sculpt the whole book to lead toward the practical advice. And I wanted to have the freedom to, if we don't know the answer to what's the right way to hydrate for a marathon, if it's a sort of, well, it's a continuum, and some people need to drink more and some people less. I wanted to be able to leave it hanging there instead of trying to boil it into a book. So that was, that was a discussion I had with my agent right at the start, and then with my editor, saying, I don't want to do this. And they're like, well, okay, it's your funeral, man. You can do it. It's people want advice, and I understand that. I want the sort of, what's the bottom line? What do we take away from this? And ultimately, the bottom line I hope people will take away from the book is not do these 6 things. It's that the limits of endurance are a lot less clear-cut than they feel sometimes. That when you're pushing it's your limit and you just feel like, well, I guess that's what my legs were capable of. That's seldom really the case. And there's a billion things that may or may not have been affecting your perception of those limits, but it wasn't just that your legs were completely incapable of going farther.
Yeah, I'm biased, and like I sort of alluded to before, I think it's a really healthy message, because it makes people realize, and it's so significant when it comes to pain and injury, that your body is robust and strong. It's got these defense mechanisms, and people aren't as fragile as they think they are. And it's just a healthy message that it just puts the biopsycho into, and the social aspects all together. I think it all fits in very nicely. So it is a very healthy book for runners to read. There will be misconceptions like, oh, right, so you're saying that my legs are fine to go, I just got to convince myself, and it's not that clear cut. Yeah. But you can do a lot worse, can't you? Especially when you're injured. If you stop worrying so much about whether you've got a stress fracture when you've been diagnosed that it's not a stress fracture, then you can actually reduce that pain and potentially recover. That could be what's holding you back. So there's a lot of parallels there for runners who are who are injured as well and trying to recover properly.
Yeah, for me with injuries, it's never the pain that stops me from running. It's the fear that the pain is an indication that it's going to get worse. And so that's why sometimes a diagnosis, even if it's a false one, is such a relief. It's like, oh, okay, so it's okay. It's okay if it hurts like that. In that case, I don't care. But but I'll limp through it if it's like, oh, this could be a sign that I'm going to be, it's going to be getting something that becomes chronic and that is going to torpedo my whole season. Then it's like, oh God, I can't run on this. So you really feel the effect of the perceptions and the way you're framing those feelings.
Definitely. Listen, we gotta have a mention for. I'm so happy that you're coming to London after, I think you mentioned, like, well, quite a few years of not coming to England, and that's happening with Mr. Tom Goom, isn't it? Running physio himself. That's going to be in April. Let's bring this up. Make sure if I've got the date here actually correct. Let's put that on here. So yeah, Tom Goom is putting together a fantastic running rehab from pain to performance, a new one-day conference, which is oh geez, I haven't got the date here. Do you know the date?
I think it's April 24th. Whatever day the London Marathon is, it's the Friday.
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah, that's a good way of remembering it. And it's going to be your good self there speaking, as well as Ian Griffiths, who we've obviously had on the show, was at the Runchatlive conference, and Chris Napier, and Claire Minshall as well. So yeah, it's going to be a fantastic conference with all four of you, and Tom, of course, speaking as well. If people want details of that, then go to Tom's webpage. All details are on there. Yeah, tickets are on sale now. It's going to be a cracking day and a chance to not just Alex, but obviously a chance to definitely meet and see Alex Hutchinson in person talking. What are you talking on for that, by the way? I have read it, but I can't think of.
Yeah, it's, I'm still working out exactly because I don't want to just give my sort of standard talk about the book. I want to talk a little bit more about some of the things that you're talking about, the way that are in the context of rehab a little bit and injury and the perception of pain, how the mind and body interact and how that how it's relevant to injury and rehab as well as to performance. I'm still kind of bouncing around some ideas of exactly what I want to get into, because I think it's a really neat lineup with people with different backgrounds, different expertises. And so I want to make sure that I'm giving sort of continuing the train of thought from the previous four speakers, as opposed to just sort of you're running through the ropes of my usual talk.
Well, it's going to be a cracking day. I'm looking forward to hopefully kid arrangements put in place of coming up as well myself. I can't guarantee anything.
Yeah. No, I know how that is.
Claire Minch was just saying as well, looking forward to meeting you, Alex. Awesome program. Tom Goom, yeah, hats off to Tom Goom. Yeah. And I like to think in some way that the Runchatlive conference in November actually spawned this a little bit.
I think it did, yeah. No, we definitely all.
And I've got to get Tom would be lovely as well. I did try and get Tom for the Runchatlive, but he's got a little kid as well, and it's tricky, isn't it? You on the children front yourself? I don't know. It's a bit of a personal question, but
3-year-old, and just turned 6. And yeah, the London conference, actually, my wife has a conference the week before and the week after. So I would have loved to spend a week, catching up with old friends and traveling around London, but it's like I'm already. Oh man! The day I leave, my wife will still be gone, so my parents will have to. Yeah. Anyway, not to go into the details, but it's the childcare thing is a challenge when you want to bounce around the world.
But hey, we're just happy that we're going to have you for a whole day in London, which will be fantastic. And I encourage people to snap those tickets up now. That's not long away, actually. Now, what else have you got planned between now and then? Anything coming up in particular?
No, I've got a few. Talks here and there, and I've got a few vacations, going to visit my in-laws in Arizona, get some warm weather from the Toronto heat, or Toronto cold rather. But other than that, just sitting at my desk reading studies and trying to figure out what the heck they're talking about.
Brilliant. And in terms of people contacting you, it used to be sweatscience.com, didn't it? But now that's changed.
Yeah. Oh, I may have let that go. AlexHutchinson.net is my website, but Twitter's probably the best place to sort of figure out what I've got going on, and also to reach out to me via direct message or via just a tweet. I find the truth is my inbox is so brutally out of control that you're much more likely to get a quick reply on Twitter than anywhere else.
Yeah, I think you're most active on Twitter. You're very active on Twitter. I don't know whether it's just you've increased in the time that I've been kind of focusing very much on what you're saying, but you must be one of these people with your hand glued to your phone a lot of the time.
I generally don't do it on my phone. I do it on my computer, but it is probably it's proportional to my decrease in productivity that I'm.
Yeah, same as it all, isn't it?
It's a bad habit, but it's also a fascinating place and a great place to interact with.
Oh, definitely.
Sure.
Yeah, no, I'm not criticizing it at all, because the amount of people who can learn off the things which you put out there and discuss and come back to is amazing. It's one of the good uses of internet, really. Definitely, it comes to CPD. You can learn more from following you for a week on Twitter than any course, I think, in the UK at the moment. So, I mean, and it's free, so definitely. Okay, well, look, I'm sorry I've taken up more time than I promised, but Alex, thank you so much. I can't wait to listen back to this. And I really encourage people to go out and buy the book or on Audible. The Audible's worth it just to hear how many times he pronounces Kipchoge.
I know. Oh man,
that's fun. That's
lessons
good.
learned for next time.
That's okay. It's all right.
Yeah.
So yeah, thank you so much. And yeah, hopefully we'll catch up in London in April for Tom Goom's running conference.
Thanks a lot, Matt. It's been a pleasure. I appreciate the conversation.
No worries. I'm going to let you go now to the lobby, and then I'll come back and say thank you in person. So yeah, thanks very much, Alex Hutchinson. Wow, great. That's amazing. Yeah, what a fantastic hour. I hope you guys, thank you for joining us live. I hope you enjoyed that. And people who listen to the replay on the podcast, I do encourage you to go to YouTube or my website, runchatlive.com, to have a look at the video. One, because you see the fantastic Alex talking in person. It's just a little bit better, isn't it, with that visual as well? But also there's a few pictures up there of the people we talked about, and a wonderful picture of Alex in his kind of Japanese kind of robe thing after doing his mental brain stimulation kind of bike ride or whatever. So yeah, there's definitely some visuals worth checking out. And like I say, look out for Tom's conference coming up in April in London. Hopefully we will see you there. But that's it now. That was episode 39 of Run Chat Live. Another guest next month. You'll have to watch me on social media before I'll announce that, probably in a week's time or so. Thanks to James Morgan for coming in and listening. James, Barefoot Physio in Exeter, if I've got that right. It's very well worth watching on various social media, probably Facebook more than anything. Thanks to Nick Knight as well for coming in. The great podiatrist Nick Knight's got some great stuff out there as well. Claire Minchell, thank you for joining us as well. He's going to be speaking in London. And to everyone who came in and joined us tonight. It's fantastic to see so many people actually joining us live. But we must go now, and I'm going to go and say thanks to Alex in person. So see you next month. Guest will be announced soon. Thank you very much. You're listening to Run Chat Live podcast, putting the evidence back into running injury and performance.